get us started? Thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. We've got the snacks, the drinks. We don't mind if you start the wine now. Chris got started on the wine, right? So it was already open. So feel free to get started on the wine. That's fine. I'm Dan Speak. I'm in the philosophy department, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a few months now. So in a way, it kind of feels like the first big element of this grant project that Jason Baehr and I are on, what we're calling, quote, the LMU Intellectual Character Initiative. And we're hoping, if this sounds familiar, we're hoping to inspire faculty and leadership across colleges and disciplines to center an LMU education on the cultivation of the intellectual virtues, and with particular emphasis on curiosity, intellectual humility, open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and intellectual perseverance. We're calling these cringily the virtues of the lion mind. Will you tolerate us calling them that? Okay. That's what we're calling them. No, Roberta says no. Okay, fair enough. If you got to resist. But if you're interested in that project, especially as you hear more about what's going on here, we've got a sign-up sheet for an email list. That's someplace. Where did you say you were putting that? Back corner. Back corner. So if you want to get more information about our project, we're about to go live with our website. Yeah, we're getting close. So, and then all of Jason's TikTok videos are going on. Okay. So for the purposes of what our project is about, this conversation between Jason Baehr and Michael Lamb is really, it's nearly ideal. These two, I'm not exaggerating when I say these two could headline conferences on our topic at any institution in the world. I genuinely believe that. So I'm exceedingly grateful that we're going to get to have this conversation here with us today. You probably don't need me to introduce Jason Baehr, but I'm going to do it anyways, in part because it can be easy to lose track of just how cool our own colleagues are. Okay. So, and Jason is, by my lights, indeed cool, even if I'd ask you not to tell him I said so. Okay, so keep that between us, that I think he's cool. He's, of course, a world-class virtue epistemologist. As the author of The Inquiring Mind on Intellectual Virtues and Virtue Epistemology with Oxford University Press in 2011. He was the director of a $1 million Templeton grant on the topic of intellectual virtues in education between 2012 and 2015. He's the author of Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues with Harvard Education Press in 2021. And some of us in this room are being forced to slog through that presently. And most recently, he's the author of Inquiry and Agency, A Theory of Intellectual Virtues and Vices with OUP that's just come out this year. But he's also the founder of one of the most compelling public charter schools you'll ever see. The Intellectual Virtues Academy of Long Beach now has more than a decade of profound experience educating middle school and high school students in one of the most diverse settings in the country. And the place simply crackles with the joy of learning and the wisdom of inquiry. And our principal of IVA Middle School is also here with us, Jackie Bryant, who is just fantastic. I'm telling you, it isn't enough to say that Jason's fingerprints are all over the Intellectual Virtues Academy, though they are, as you all agree, right, Jackie? His fingerprints are all over. But more deeply, IVA is a place in which the best of Jason's thinking and hoping about education have come to life. They really have. So if you don't believe me, check it out. Intellectual Virtues Academy of Long Beach. It's an amazing place. Now, Michael Lamb is no slouch either. Okay? He's the F.M. Kirby Foundation Chair of Leadership and Character, the Executive Director of the Program for Leadership and Character, and Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Humanities, all at Wake Forest University. He's also an Associate Fellow of the Oxford Character Project. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton, a BA in political science from Rhodes College, and a second BA in philosophy and theology from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. He's okay, right? Yeah, exactly. So his research focuses on the ethics of citizenship and the role of virtues in public life. His book, A Commonwealth of Hope, Augustine's Political Thought, published with Princeton in 2022, offers a novel interpretation of Augustine's political thought and recovers Augustine's virtue of hope to inform contemporary politics. can you imagine a world in which we might need the virtue of hope to reflect on contemporary politics? That might be nice.
Yeah.
Okay. He's also the co-editor of Cultivating Virtue in the University with Oxford University Press and Everyday Ethics, Moral Theology and the Practices of Ordinary Life with Georgetown University Press. And he's published his articles in American Political Science Review, Review of Politics, Journal of Religious Ethics, Journal of Moral Education, blah, blah, blah. Perhaps particularly relevant to us here, as we have this opportunity to have this conversation here in the CFD, is that Michael has won teaching awards at Princeton, Oxford, and Wake Forest. If we let him hang around here for another day and a half, he'll probably get a teaching award. Right, exactly. Further, he helped to launch the Oxford Character Project, and he served as the Dean of Leadership Service and Character Development for Rhodes Scholars. And finally, I'll note that the Lilly Endowment continues to entrust him with millions of dollars to distribute with the purpose of building capacity at colleges and universities to educate character. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Jason and Michael as we discuss how to develop intellectual character.
Thanks to everybody who's here. It feels like just an honor to have you be present with us, to come and listen to a conversation and then participate in the conversation as well. So the way we're going to go, I'm just going to kind of interview Michael, and we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit, and then we're hoping to leave a good bit of time for Q&A to continue the conversation. So Michael, maybe you could begin by telling us a little bit more about your work at the Program for Leadership and Character, which houses the Educating Character Initiative. What are you guys up to? What are you accomplishing?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Dan, for the invitation, Jason, for the friendship. I've known Dan and Jason for years now. It's really grateful for the ways they're doing this work here and really bringing a community together around importance of character and intellectual character. So grateful to be part of this conversation. So I've been at Wake Forest now I've been there 9 years, my 10th year this year, and we have a program there for leadership and character that helps think about how we help students develop the virtues they need to lead for humanity. Our motto at Wake Forest is Pro Humanitate, or for humanity. So that's part of what we do. We do that in various ways. We do that through, we have work in both our college for undergraduates, but also our professional schools, especially law and medicine. And we offer courses that we teach on these topics in different fields, from computer science and engineering to humanities and entrepreneurship. We also train faculty, much like you all do here in this room, in this center. Every summer, we have about 140 faculty who've been through our workshops to develop courses on character in their own fields. So really expansive effort there to really train faculty with our Center for Teaching at Wake Forest as well. We also do a lot of work outside the curriculum. So we have various programming, some that are cohort programs. We have students on scholarship or ambassadors programs. They kind of do very intensive work as a community or cohort over 4 years or 1 year. We also have one-off programming, workshops, retreats, speakers who come in talking about character and leadership. And we also have embedded programming where we help work with different staff and faculty in different areas of campus life, athletics, the arts, sustainability, residence life, to really embed this work in what students are already doing, right, in ways that make it accessible to them and meet them where they are. And we have a research team who kind of analyzes all of that and figure out what's working well and what's not. It's publishing papers about that all the time. That's work happening at Wake Forest. We also have this initiative, which Jason mentioned and Dan did too, called the Educating Character Initiative, which has been supported by a Lilly Endowment grant to help other universities, including LMU in this case, in various ways. So we offer to various universities across the country workshops and webinars on character. We provide consulting and coaching for institutions on character. We also offer grants that help support initiatives on campuses that really fit the campus culture already. So our aim is not to sort of replicate what Wake Forest did, but to figure out what you all want to do and how to empower you to do that in ways that fit your own context and culture here. And we've been delighted by the work happening at LMU on intellectual character here. I think it's really great work here. We were so impressed by the application you all put in this year, and it really stood out to us as one of the kind of top applications in our pool of 170 across the country. So really impressive work's happening here because you have scholars already who are doing work, but also who can make that work, as you did in IBA, practical and relevant in ways that really hit the ground and make it meaningful for students. So we're glad to be part of that work. We now have given out 146 grants to institutions and about $35 million the last 2 years, and we'll give out about another $15 million this coming year to institutions across the country.
Wonderful. Your background is as a political theorist. How does one move from political theory
Mhm.
to talking to the kind of commitment you have to character and character education? What made you gravitate toward the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I always was interested in philosophy. I didn't major in it as an undergrad, but took a lot of courses in it, and then did a second BA in philosophy and theology. 'Cause I really had sort of core questions about how to live. I remember Socrates and in the Republic talking about most important question is how are we to live, and that felt really real for me. And I found philosophy especially to be a place where I could ask those questions and really not just to understand intellectually how to live, but actually to grapple with it. In fact, my first encounter with philosophy was in a first year seminar called Search for Values, where the whole idea was to actually search for your values by reading these great texts. And that really challenged me. And it really helped me see that these questions I had for a long time about how to live, about what is justice or what is truth, of course, I could actually study in a formal setting. So that was really part of my own development. And what I realized was that I really wanted to make sure that the philosophy I did really mattered to the world. I was in Oxford taking a second BA in philosophy and theology, and had a tutor in philosophy of religion who, in my first meetings, I'd written this paper about the problem of evil, which is how does a good God exist if there's evil and suffering in the world? And they just been in that tsunami hit Japan in 2005, and I was grappling with how does a good God exist with all this suffering? This is a real problem. So I spent the first paragraph or two paragraphs talking about this real suffering that was a problem and how it creates a challenge, and 8 pages talking about the philosophy, and the analytic sort of arguments for this issue. My tutor said in his very British accent that it's an excellent essay, except the first paragraph. It's not detached enough for an essay in philosophy at Oxford. And so I realized that I wanted my philosophy to be not detached, but engaged in the world. And so political philosophy gave me a chance to think, how do I do that? Take these ideas and make them relevant for politics in the world. But it includes a lot of thought about not just what societies should do, but also what we as citizens should do and be to be effective citizens. So that for me was how I got into this work. And anybody here a political science major or scholar in any way? John, raise your hand guiltily. Yeah, good. In political science, there's been a trend in the last few years.
Scare quotes.
There's scare quotes. Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. What John does is think about often structures and procedures, so laws, government systems, and often politics can be reduced to those things, and it doesn't actually take into account the kind of virtues or qualities as citizens we need to change those systems and or have new laws. And so my real attention has been on how we think about those questions of character as being an important part, not only of philosophy, but also political science and political theory about how we live together as citizens.
Yeah, now you got me wondering, how has your background in political theory informed how you think about character education?
Yeah. Well, it has made me much more focused on, I think two ways that I'm now thinking about it. One is that it's made it much more political in the widest sense, not partisan.
Yeah.
In fact, we're pretty, trying to avoid partisanship to the students from various parts of the spectrum on our campus, but very much focused on what we do internally, individually, actually affects our civic life and how we think about preparing for our civic life. So I just gave a talk last week on character in the Constitution, about how our Constitution, the laws, structures depends on citizens to actually enforce and maintain those institutions. Without citizens and leaders who actually care about character, we can actually preserve this piece of parchment on its own. So that's one important piece. I think the second piece is this. Sometimes in other parts of the character movement, character can be quite individualistic. Your own qualities, your own success, your own grit, your own flourishing, and can ignore the social communal context for character and the social communal aims of character. And what I think political theory does is force you to really grapple with those communal contexts and aims of character in a way that just focus on pure individual philosophy might not.
We're throwing around these terms like character and virtue. Could you give us a kind of thumbnail definition or description of what you mean by character?
Yeah.
And also by virtue? And if
Yeah.
you're willing to go even further, maybe some kind of distinction between intellectual character, intellectual virtues on the
Yeah.
one hand, and then what probably most people think of when they think about character and virtue is is something in the direction of civic character or moral character. So character, virtue, intellectual character compared to other forms of
Okay,
character.
map it all out here.
Yes,
I got a
that's
board here. I
right.
can need a
That's
board
right.
here if I need to.
That's right.
So I think about character as just a set of dispositions, kind of stable, reliable, enduring habits that we have that help us think, feel, and act in certain ways, right? And so that's kind of what character is, a set of qualities or dispositions that help us act. Now, this can be good or bad. So good qualities would be virtues, right? And bad qualities might be vices, or you might have another word for them, but help us think and feel differently. So I think virtues are those capacities to help us think, feel, and act in the right ways for the right reasons. So they're capacities that really help kind of guide us toward important goods that we might have. And so in many ways, virtue in Greek, the word arete also means excellence. So there's excellences, our excellent capacities to think, feel, and act well to secure or achieve or protect these important goods. So intellectual virtues for me are virtues that are helping to make our capacities to think excellent, right? So they're the virtues of thought that we might have that help us think, deliberate, decide well, the capacity we need to actually be good thinkers in some way. So you might think about the virtues that you all mentioned, focus on here, intellectual courage, humility, attentiveness, carefulness, thoroughness, right? Are all important virtues for thinking well and making good decisions, but also not just deciding, but also discerning and perceiving what might be needed or relevant in a case. Moral virtues would be those that actually help us sort of feel and act well. So virtues of feeling might be courage in some cases, because you actually need to have the right response to fear when it arises, for example. Or temperance, to make sure our desires don't come out of control, to kind of restrain and moderate our desires towards certain goods. But you also have virtues that help direct us toward other people. So like justice, for example, that helps us give others what they are due based on the needs of the moment or their own own rights, for example, or compassion to help respond to suffering in some way. So for me, I think these virtues often are focused on what capacities they perfect and how they sort of can be used to make us more excellent human beings.
It's great. And I mean, we're on, I say we because I said more or less what I would say as well. And we're on thin ice in a way, because these
Yeah.
distinctions, once you really start to press on them, some of you are probably thinking, well, hold on, wait a second. Maybe we can talk more about this in the
Great. Yeah.
in the Q&A, but thank you for that. The other thing I want to ask you, just kind of by way of introduction here, has to do with exemplars of virtue, and we'll focus on intellectual virtue in particular. Of course, exemplars are just people who embody or exemplify a virtue in an especially powerful, full, compelling, excellent way. And I'm curious to hear you talk about, if you would, some exemplar of intellectual virtue that you've met or know maybe, and what are they like, and how does their mind work, and how do you see their character, their intellectual character, kind of expressing itself?
Yeah, well, I love this question. In part, I think I've been very fortunate to have lots of exemplars in my life and mentors for me. And one that comes to mind immediately is my graduate school advisor. His name is Jeffrey Stout. He's a scholar of religion and philosophy. He's an incredible teacher. He's someone who's very, very curious. He was trained in religion, but then did work in philosophy and political theory, and then literature. He does work on film. So he's very curious about different ways to understand these big questions. And not only the content of his questions, but also his methodology. So here's someone who is in his 60s, developed a new methodology, took on ethnography to address community organizing, because he realized that he couldn't do that just by pure analysis. You need to actually interview people on the ground to figure out how to write about community organizing. So to do that at that point in your career, when you could easily just keep skating, is a really shows curiosity, I think, and tenacity in that way. He's exceptionally careful and precise in how he uses language. And so as a grad student, it's really challenging to be a student. He's going to make you, every word is going to be the precise word, but he also recognizes that precision is not the same as clarity. and things can be precise and also very unclear. So clarity also for him is very important. So he talked about the importance of making our words accessible. So he's really a top scholar in the field, top of his association, was president of the association, but also really accessible in his language. Hated jargon. If you use jargon, he's going to sort of help you not use jargon. And so really careful there. He also was very thorough. I'd submit a paper for a seminar or a dissertation chapter to him, and he'd give me 5 pages of single space feedback on that chapter and go by line, right? Also, just really attentive to my own development. And I think finally, I'd say this: he has a strong sense of intellectual purpose, and he would design classes for what his graduate students would need. Now, he wanted to teach, had his own research agenda. What do these students in my class need? How can I design a class that helps them get what they need for their dissertation projects? That's pretty amazing. And he also was such an amazing teacher. So he thought a lot about teaching, despite his excellence in scholarship. And I was at a lunch once with him with a former student of his who's a very famous scholar at the point, who's back to have lunch and meet some of the students. And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad the semester's almost over. I can now get back to my work." When she meant her research. He said, "Stop. Teaching is our work. Our research just make us better teachers or others better teachers, but teaching is our work." And so I think he saw teaching as his work. And for me, that's a real sign of virtue. He could really pursue these other goods for his own status or esteem. He really devoted time to students to help teach in that way.
A virtue that I don't think you named, but that you just described there, would be intellectual humility as well.
It would, yeah, right, exactly, yeah, totally.
Not preoccupied with status and
Yeah.
pecking orders and rankings, and just willing to sort of be there,
Yeah.
present with the students.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So let's shift now. I have 3 kind of skeptical questions that some of you may be thinking in terms
Dan
of.
plant those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right, that's right. These are questions that are just sort of out there in the atmosphere in academic conversations about virtue and educating for virtue. The first one is this. So some people worry about any kind of appeal to virtue in a pluralistic context. You know, some people think that virtues differ from one tradition to another. We're in a very pluralistic environment here where we don't all come from the same tradition, so on. Is it possible in a pluralistic environment to identify a set of common virtues that we can sort of agree on and think of in roughly similar ways and value it at some similar level?
I think so. I think it is. I think it's not easy, and we shouldn't skate over it too quickly. The differences there, and so I think it's really important to think about the different traditions that are informing us here. I think about virtues as those qualities help us flourish in various ways. And if we all are human beings, then we need certain capacities to be excellent, right? To think, feel, and act in excellent ways. And so those virtues that might help us do that are just those things we might can share in common. So think about curiosity or courage or humility or wisdom being those kind of virtues. Now, we might then say we can have a common set of concepts here, or even agree as people at LMU, you want to value these things together as a community and can provide some basic kind of common ground there. But what's important is that these virtues are all relative to us in various ways, to our own context, our own personality, our own circumstances. And so they're context sensitive, which means that it might look different for different people depending on their context. So here's an example. So think about the virtue of courage. We can all agree that responding well to fear might be an important virtue for us. And that courage should avoid both cowardice on one hand, but also rashness or recklessness on the other, being too bold and not being very wise in how one acts, right? So we can share that agreement. But now what causes fear might be different for me and you, given our backgrounds, right? Our age, our status, our profession, our culture, our gender, etc. And I might be tempted by different vices than you. I might be more tempted by cowardice, given my background. You maybe by recklessness or something else, right? And so we often have different ways to think about those parts of a virtue that make it quite distinctive. Now, doesn't mean that we're always going to agree per se. And I think that engagement is quite helpful across traditions. So here's an example. I spent time studying the virtue of hope, right? And many traditions have a very strong virtue of hope. It's common across, secular philosophy, Christian philosophy, Judaism, Islam, but not Buddhism. as one of my Buddhist priest friends told me, because if Buddhism requires you to detach from a future state and outcome, and hope really requires kind of desire towards something you're working toward. And so there can be fruitful tensions here that we can use, kind of bring out ways to think about these different concepts. So I think that's very healthy. We actually have a program at Wake Forest called the Principal Pluralism Fellowship, where we help students think about how to navigate differences and use virtues to do that. So curiosity, empathy, humility, justice. And we think that actually do that together actually helps you not only kind of understand the virtues, but also build them by engaging difference in a constructive way.
That's really helpful. I like that you drew attention to how virtues are contextually sensitive and kind of relative. That we might be able to agree that generosity is a virtue, but what it's going to demand of a person is going to depend very much on their situation, very much on the resources that they happen to have at their disposal. And the same is true of all the virtues, whether intellectual or otherwise. One thing I'll just piggyback on here is to note that I think one of the reasons that Dan and I have decided to focus on intellectual virtues in particular in our project is that they sort of arise from or flow from or are motivated by a concern with what philosophers call epistemic goods, like knowledge, truth, understanding. And at an academic institution, it's taken for granted that knowledge is valuable. And so intellectual virtues are just going to be the personal qualities or character traits that we need in order to pursue knowledge well. So if you buy into the value of knowledge, you should accept some, and you think that knowledge sometimes makes demands on our agency or our character, then you should be on board with some sort of way of thinking about intellectual virtues. But I can imagine a similar thing. We all care about justice as well. So what are the agential demands of justice? That'll put us in the vicinity of various virtues. Okay, here's kind of a related challenge question, which is that for some people, especially in today's world, language of character and virtue feels very loaded. We talk about virtue signaling. There's a history of character education that puts it very closely to, oriented toward a more sort of politically conservative worldviews. So that notion of virtue is necessarily religious. Like, how do you navigate some of those questions or think about some of those questions?
Yeah, I think these concepts don't come sort of, they're always loaded with uses and meanings. And I think it's very important to be aware of those. And also to think about, is that required as part of the concept, or can it actually be sort of just one expression of it? So I do think for both cases that historically in this country, at least, character, at least from the 80s and 90s, was often seen as a conservative kind of sort of slogan, right? And you had Bill Bennett, the Secretary of Education, who was under Reagan, who had the Book of Virtues. And there's a lot of focus on that. But what you also see both in the field of virtue ethics and in the larger movement, others challenging that view of what virtue is. In fact, there's a scholar I worked with in grad school. He has a book on liberal virtues, Steve Macedo. Lisa Tessman has a book on virtue ethics for liberatory struggles, right? How we think about liberating virtue. Many folks, including Brian in the back, talked about virtue for environmental causes, right? And so I think there's a lot of ways we might think about these questions as being virtues we all need, whatever we actually choose to identify politically. We need these virtues to help us achieve important goods, political, moral, intellectual. So I don't think it is inherently conservative. In fact, if you look at different movements, right, including the civil rights movement, you see language of virtue all over the place. Justice, hope, courage, love, right? Very important virtues for that movement. As far as religion goes, I think what you do see is that virtue is very at home in various traditions. Now you see a lot of work on virtue, not only in kind of Judeo-Christian context, but also in Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, many indigenous traditions now engaging language of virtue and character to kind of capture things that have been part of that tradition for a long time. But even then, it's not required to be religious. In fact, and the origins of the word character in the ancient Greek is a pretty naturalistic or secular context for that work. You also see many secular philosophers engaging these questions without having any commitments at all to the divine, anyway. So I think it's not required for that. And so I think there are ways we can kind of come to this conversation from different standpoints. I also think it's important for us to recognize that we aren't neutral either. We've been formed in different traditions, different cultures, and ways that we bring our own assumptions about character and virtue to those conversations. So just being aware of our own formation is very important, and how our formation might differ from those who might come from different backgrounds or traditions. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah.
I mean, do you agree?
I do. I think that's
Yeah.
very well said. Yeah. The speaking of our formation, kind of a third skeptical concern that we'll sometimes run into has to do with trying to educate for virtue or character at the university level rather than in the sort of earlier grades or educational levels. And the worry is, well, look, aren't we already like pretty fully formed by the time that we show up to university? Is it realistic to think that educational institutions or individual professors can have a meaningful or significant impact on the character or virtue of their students?
Yes, it's a very ancient worry. Aristotle thought something similar to that, and his concern about ethics in ancient Greece. I do think it's possible. In fact, research now shows it's possible. So there's been research in psychology the last few years which showed that we keep developing our character through our 70s at least. So there's hope for you, John, yet to have good character here.
That's a stretch.
Yeah. So I think there's research showing that actually we do change across the lifespan. But especially now, what research shows, there's a whole period of emerging adulthood between 18 and 29, where there's a lot of shifts now because we are, compared to past generations, marrying later or less. We are changing jobs more frequently. We're also having more education than the past. And so our identity is very in flux. And we're trying to figure out who we are, what we care about. We don't have commitments that might ground us in a place or relationship or a community yet. Right? We're often pretty transient. And so in that space, we can actually be quite self-focused. And so they show that actually in that space, we're actually changing a lot in those years you might be in college or university. So that's a very important time of formation. So there is evidence showing that you can change. And also I've seen it with my students at Wake Forest. We teach courses on character there, and we do studies of our courses that assess the impact of them compared to control groups of those not in our courses, and found that across various courses, students in our courses actually increase over 15 weeks in key virtue measures empirically compared to control groups of students same age, same stage, but in a different course. And so I think there is evidence there. And I'll just say from my own experience, my character is still in progress. I think I'm growing every year. I think this past year I've been growing a lot in various ways. And so I do think my own experience has been that it can change. Thank goodness, because I need some work to do on my character too. So,
A related point that's consistent with everything you said is that we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking about growth in character or the possession of a virtue in all or nothing terms.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. We
Yeah.
can make incremental progress along
That's right.
certain dimensions of our character, or certain dimensions of virtue. And that can be absolutely worthwhile.
Yeah.
Similarly for our students, if the question is, can I'm looking at my students here in the course of a semester, help all of my students become exemplars of intellectual virtue, right? That's not very realistic, right? But can I, in a given course or year, have an impact on a non-trivial number of my students,
Yeah.
and in their development of something like curiosity or open-mindedness or intellectual humility to a kind of meaningful degree? If the answer to that question is yes, and if doing so on my part as a teacher, if the demands on me aren't that great, then it seems like it's a feasible and worthwhile thing to
Yeah.
try.
Absolutely. Yeah. Have you all heard the growth mindset here? A pretty common concept now. There's now research on the moral growth mindset about the need to actually think about how you might have a growth mindset toward your own character or moral growth. And it's a very helpful way to think about, we're not perfect. We can't expect to be perfect, but we can grow. And that kind of approach to character kind of gives us kind of the freedom and agency to do that and not be sort of stuck by failures or by lack of progress. We can keep growing in ways that make it really strong.
Great. It's a nice transition to thinking about what those of us who teach or otherwise engage with students can do in a classroom or other kind of educational context. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about kind of the process of trying to teach for intellectual character formation. What are some things that those of us who teach or otherwise we're students, what are some things we can do in the classroom? And then maybe also, what are some things we might do well to avoid or to sort of stop doing?
Yeah, great question. And first I'd say read Professor Baehr's book. It's a terrific book. And I'll say this because he's here. Actually, it's my favorite book on how to educate character. It's really excellent. And I think it's really drawn not only the scholarship, which, as Dan said, he's one of the leading scholars in the world on character, but also his experience at Intellectual Virtues Academy, which makes it really practical and accessible in a very, very helpful way. So I think that's a really important book to read. And much of my work is actually on these strategies for developing character. And he and I agree on a lot of these. So it's a lot of similarity there in how we think about these questions. So I think a few things that we could do is first is what you might call virtue literacy or language about virtue, helping students understand what virtue is, what character is, what particular virtues are. So you can do that as Professor Baehr does in his classes by using direct instruction, giving readings, or helping students think about definitions or concepts in very clear and thoughtful ways, and then applying that throughout their semester. You might also think about maybe less involved instruction, but actually still valuable. So choosing one virtue that you might want to cultivate, and then having students in your class think about that virtue. Or it could be, is there a context you're in, perhaps a library, for example, where you help students think about sort of being data literate and information literacy, right? How do you actually process information well? How can virtues like, carefulness and thoroughness and attentiveness help students in that context think about these questions? So finding ways to talk about, discuss, debate character and virtue is really helpful. That's one way, creating virtue literacy. Second would be practice, right? Despite if we know about the virtues, doesn't mean we actually embody or practice them. So how do we help practice the virtues? And so creating ways for students in your classes or programs to actually practice these important virtues and apply what they're learning in the classroom, their own life in a very tangible way. So for example, right now I'm teaching a course called Commencing Character, which pairs the study of character with commencement speeches on different virtues. And students in the class actually have to do one assignment where they choose a virtue they want to cultivate or strengthen, analyze it conceptually as a good philosophy student would, then develop a practical plan based on research, and then spend 2 weeks trying to apply that plan to their own life. And so practicing these ideas in very tangible ways and reflecting on that to understand what they can learn from that process. So third is actually reflection, right? How we create times for students to reflect on the role of important virtues in their life or important vices, right? It's often hard to know what humility might look like, but you probably know what arrogance might look like, right? It's pretty clear, right? And how that might actually cause you to feel a certain way, respond in certain ways. So have students reflect on these important concepts can be very helpful for this process. And then finally, I'll just say what you've already said, Jason, is the importance of exemplars or role models. How we help students identify in their own life role models of particular virtues or anti-exemplars, those who might actually embody vices that can help us give some clarity about why virtues matter and what they might be, right? So in my class, I also have students do this one assignment called a profile in character. They choose one of their own role models or exemplars in their own life and then interview them for an hour about their character and then write a profile of that person's character and how it was formed and also how it shaped them as a student. So it helps really kind of build that awareness of how our people in our lives are actually our exemplars. You might think those exemplars might be people in history, like, those great heroes like, King or Gandhi or Dan Speake, these heroes, right? But you also have people actually, what research shows that people who are relevant and attainable to you, people just maybe a little bit above you or same stage or same profession or same career choice actually are more helpful because those heroes can be so good, they can be disempowering for us. I can never be as good as King or Gandhi or name your hero. But I can be as good as my friend here, my teacher here, or my coach here, right? So that's one thing to think about in your own life.
Yeah. You mentioned this, but didn't really develop. How important is it for us as the instructors to embody, exemplify the virtues that we're hoping we'll see and try to nurture in our students?
I think it's important in several ways. One is if exemplars are how we form character, and even neuroscience suggests that actually that's how we learn. We often learn by imitating people, kind of even unconsciously. Then professors and leaders can actually be exemplars in the classroom. We have to model kind of character we want to see in our students and in others, right? We need to model that. The students are watching us even even realizing they're doing that, right? So if we're not humble about what we do or don't know, we're not open-minded about other ideas or perspectives, if we're not actually careful in how we grade our papers, or attentive in how we grade papers, then they see that and can recognize what matters to us. But also, I think, like, secondly, do this work on character authentically, and I think with integrity. We have to do it ourselves. Right? My favorite books is Courage to Teach by Parker Palmer. And one key insight from that book is that to teach anything, but especially character, I think, requires us to actually do the work ourselves. Think about our own character growth, to be engaged in our own pursuit of virtue, and to take that work seriously. Otherwise, we can be professing virtue without actually embodying it or being true to it. So if we will expect students to do this hard work, we need to do it ourselves and have integrity in that.
Yeah, I'm struck by how we can get the virtue literacy part down easily.
Yeah, totally.
But if our own dispositions and attitudes contradict the virtues that we're teaching students about, it's just undermine our efforts.
Well, and I'll just add to that. There's also some research showing that those who are really good at using ethical language can use that language to rationalize behaviors or to ethics wash in ways that make something that might not be ethical seem ethical, right? And so if you want to kind of argue about this, there's an article called Cheeseburger Ethics by a philosopher about how philosophers at different conferences actually, those who study ethics were even less ethical than those who study other disciplines of philosophy, because they can rationalize leaving their trash on the seat, right? For example. And so just being aware of how just knowing the language of something doesn't mean that we actually embody it. That's very important for us to be aware of that.
You're bringing to mind something else, which is that, I mean, it's kind of a hazard for those of us who study virtue and character. It's easy to use those categories in judgmental ways.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And so, talk to me about how we need to be thoughtful and sort of delicate in our use of this language, especially I'm thinking with students, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to talk about the importance of carefulness in my class and then berate a student for their lack of carefulness on that, right? They're using the virtue concepts to sort of criticize or shame students or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about how to navigate that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to recognize that done well, especially in a university context like this, it can't be imposed on students. We need to figure out ways to engage them critically in these conversations and with their own autonomy, right? And that's very important here. I think, especially in a context like university where you're all adults, right? We want you to engage critically. In fact, that's how you do this work well. That's the first thing. I think, secondly, it is very important to recognize that this language can be and has been historically weaponized to make certain people feel like they actually aren't good enough or don't belong or aren't part of the actual, culture in the right way. And that's one danger here. And so just being very alert to that history, first of all, so we can be alert not to follow its mistakes, but also to be aware of how we're using it ourselves. And I think what I like to do in my own work is to call attention to aspirations towards certain virtues, rather than criticizing students for not being a certain way, actually calling them, kind of help them grow toward an aspirational ideal they actually want to embody themselves. And it's very important for me to actually have them identify their own ideals. So in all the assignments I do for my class, they choose their exemplar, they choose their virtue, they choose what they want to work on, because I want them to actually be empowered to do that themselves, not have me tell them you should work on this virtue, right? That's not going to help anybody, right? And so I think also giving a lot of room for student autonomy is very important in this process.
Well, how about we zoom out a little? Oh, sorry, one other question on sort of practice. I'm curious as to what let's still zoom out a little bit from the classroom to thinking about the university as a whole. What are things that universities as a whole can do to sort of help promote and just sort of create conditions
Yeah.
for their students' development of intellectual virtue. So set aside what happens in individual classrooms, zoom out to the institution as a whole.
Yeah, well, I wrote an article on this a few months ago on the moral ecology of a university. I think we can't think about character as an isolated concept. We're always in an ecology here, right? We're always being shaped by what's around us, including our actual place, right? But also architecture, relationships, policies, norms, culture, right? In a broad way. So, in addition to the classroom, you also have the co-curricular programming that helps shape culture, from residence halls to student organizations and other ways. But even beyond there, you also have things like your mission statement and how much do you actually talk about, engage your mission statement. What is it? Does it support character or not? Beyond that, you have policies. What you think about in terms of how you think about certain policies on campus, it's going to affect how students think about ethics in a very prominent way, character. So we have an honor code at Wake Forest, which really shapes our character about academic integrity and honor. Now, it can be just a sort of checkbox matter of compliance. Oh, sign the honor code, and you're done with it. But we try to use it as actually kind of way to form character, kind of reminder of who we want to be as students in this culture. So that's important. Also think being attentive to relationships, right? All of us we're not just solo thinkers or students. We're actually always embedded. It could be in residence halls, our roommates. It could be faculty colleagues in a department meeting or a set of offices. It could be staff in the library or elsewhere, right? Who are engaging their colleagues with important goods. And we're not just these thinkers, who are doing our solo work. We're actually doing it together with people. How we treat each other affects what kind of culture we have, character. If we treat each other pretty poorly, that won't conduce to a positive ethical culture for this work to flourish. And so being very mindful of how we think about culture in very direct ways is really important for this. What would you add to that, Jason?
Oh, I think those are great. I think, I think I've talked about culture and norms and values and trying to bring those into alignment with the aim
Yeah.
we're talking about. Yeah. Couple more questions and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Why should let's let we be students and faculty and staff and administrators. Why should we care about educating for good intellectual character? And you could answer that question both sort of internal to thinking about education.
Yeah.
But also even sort of beyond the aims of education, why should we care about developing these qualities or taking pains to help our students develop these qualities?
Yeah. Well, I think within education, I think what you said earlier about pursuing goods like knowledge, truth is really crucial, right? So if we want to pursue these goods, and they are goods to us, then we need these virtues. We need tenacity to keep going when it's hard. We need humility to recognize our own limitations and respond to others who might have wisdom to share with us. We need courage to really do that when it might be difficult or unpopular to pursue a certain idea or express it in our own work. We need carefulness to do it very, very conscientiously, right? So these are important virtues for that process. Even think about it not only kind of in this kind of high-minded terms, but actually quite practically, right? If you're going to write a paper for a seminar, you need certain virtues. You probably need to give due to your sources, intellectual justice in a certain way to your sources. If you plagiarize ideas without citing them, that would not be intellectually effective or just. You'll need humility to recognize your own limitations, to anticipate objections to your argument, to consider different perspectives. You'll need to be careful and precise in how you explain your language. You need to be thorough in reading all the research you need to read for that topic and making sure you present it, clearly. So these virtues are important for you actually completing your assignments well. Be that in an undergraduate classroom or even as a faculty member pursuing research in our own field. So that's very important for us. Beyond the sort of academic reasons, I think there are other reasons we might care about. One is a civic reason. We have a discourse right now in a society that's driven by division and lacking intellectual virtues of humility or carefulness or intellectual courage. They might have recklessness or rashness, not always intellectual courage, right? So we need these virtues to have a civic discourse where we can engage across differences constructively and not just shout across divides. So I think it's important for our civic life. Also professional life. So research shows that many employers now looking for future employees who show good character. In fact, on recent survey of employers, the top 3 desirable skills were communication, teamwork, and ethical decision making. Number 3, only 3 got above 85% of employers, right? Number 3, right? So to make good decisions is very important for employers, especially now in an age of AI. We can outsource a lot of our content knowledge to AI. I don't think we can, but people are doing that, right? And it can kind of replace some of our kind of technical knowledge, but they can't outsource good judgment or empathy or humility, right? We need human beings having that kind of capacity. In fact, having those capacities makes you more kind of resilient against AI, sort of overtaking your jobs or options. A few more reasons. One would be mental health and well-being. There's interesting research coming out now about the ways we need certain virtues can help us actually flourish and have more well-being. If we think about resilience or even intellectual gratitude, maybe help kind of be protective factors against certain kinds of challenges we might face. And then finally, I just would say this as more of a reason here at LMU, perhaps, is there could be institutional reasons we value it. So beyond just academic ones, we might value it because we help students be retained year after year, right, in their classes. It might help recruitment in some ways. You might have a distinctive brand, LMU, being a place that cares about intellectual character. In fact, you already have that brand, and you have it in the wider marketplace because of scholars like Jason and Dan and others here, Brian and others, right? So these are important goods you might also use that are important for LMU on top of the goods we might identify for the classroom or the civic life.
One last question. What final word or piece of advice might you leave us with on this topic?
Well, I think one is what I said earlier is just we need the courage to do this work ourselves. And that sounds easy, but the academy doesn't make room for that very much. We valorize the mind and the will, not the heart. We don't make room for us to talk about our weaknesses. We, in fact, gain our status and career by tearing other people down, showing how they're wrong and we're right, right? So our structure is actually incentivized to actually promote certain kinds of behavior that might not be intellectually virtuous. And so just being courageous enough to do the work ourselves, have the space for that work is really important for us, whether we're students or faculty or staff. Then I think secondly would be, it can feel overwhelming sometimes to have this whole new project, this new field. I gotta do this now too, talking about other demands. I gotta teach and write and mentor and go to department meetings, etc. Take the next step. You don't have to be a character expert. Just take the next step, right? Read a book, talk to your colleagues, change one assignment in your class, right? Add an assignment. Just do one small thing that helps you learn how to do it and gain more capacity in that process. So what we've seen is really amazing change, because what's happening is that students and faculty are already doing this work. You may not realize that you're doing it, right? We do our workshops with faculty. Most are already shaping character in ways they don't even realize they're doing it. So just being more aware of it helps you actually be more intentional and more critical about how to do it more effectively. So just take the next step, and I think do it one step at a time. That helps kind of get you into the process.
That next step could be signing up for our email.
Yeah, great segue, Jason. Very well done, right there.
Well, thank you so much. We're gonna have time of Q&A, but let me be the first to thank you. Why don't we open the floor first to students? I'd love it if any of the students that are here.
Don't forget about the snacks. Feel free to get up,
Yeah,
get
yeah.
snacks,
Now's a
get
good time.
drinks, etc. Just push past Professor Fingerhut.
What are students? What are you left wondering about? Please.
Thank you. It was really great to learn more about that. One thing that struck me is, I think in some of the skeptical points that were brought up about what is pushback you get from the language of virtue, or this assumption that it belongs in a conversation about religion. I think one if he's not integral to your work, he's like in it everywhere. McIntyre's virtue is like in so many things you just said. But one unstated premise, I think that's in his work that I didn't really hear today, but might be in your work, is this idea of teleology being really fundamental to virtue, in the sense that to think that they're like virtue is an excellence, or like the Latin is strength, right? It's for something basically. So I wondered, like, I thought what Professor Baehr was putting forward is this idea that the acquisition of knowledge, or having or using, properly using or properly relating to knowledge, might be that telos. But I wondered if like what was really embedded in a lot of what you said is that it's a more of a becoming or an awareness of our situation as human beings in becoming, and that it's really like a wisdom of how to live with what you have, like properly use and integrate all that. And I wonder if that's true, like if you would say that that's really at home with the way that you're thinking about it, and to what extent like that ought to be said, or whether you like think that could be well received. I think I've had like some experience or thinking that that would not be well received in a way, like people would really resent the idea that they could be classified as like a certain kind of being who ought to like ought to have intellectual humility. Like the idea that you think intellectual humility is a good thing is probably super foreign in this sense. Like you said, the incentive structure is really built up to box people out, or to like if I have the right thing, part of my job is ejecting wrong things. Whereas what you would propose, and I think it's absolutely right, is that being receptive, basically, like you're able to see, I can take in all of it and I can detect, right? So yeah, I wonder, like, as is teleology like a necessary part to bring into what your project is? And if doing so, is it a risk, or is it an added benefit to your explanatory power, or is it, how do you anticipate reception of that idea?
Yeah. So I do think that having a telos, or a purpose, to use that more modern word, is very important. In fact, I think virtue requires being directed toward a purpose in some way. Now, how we spell out the purpose can be different. We might identify more immediate goods like knowledge or truth or justice. We also might identify a more ultimate good like flourishing, and other goods are constitutive of flourishing. Now, you flourish when you have knowledge, or you have justice, or you have meaningful community, et cetera, right? So we might have these goods as being constitutive parts of this larger good of flourishing. And I think that's how I think about it, having a larger good. In fact, without that good, it's hard to determine what goods are, right? In fact, in some ways, your ultimate good kind of gives constraints on what counts as a good more immediately, right? More proximately to us. So I think there are times we need to think about different levels of goodness for ourselves. And I think also that's where you can get some real traction on finding common ground across differences. Is then we might not argue about the ultimate good up here. We might agree about certain proximate goods like knowledge or justice or this community here that we can actually agree on, despite having different ultimate aims, right? So it's called incompletely theorized agreement. It's not complete. We don't agree about everything all the way up, but we can actually have agreement on small things that might not be complete, but enough to actually work together on certain projects. So Cass Sunstein has this argument he puts forward that's really helpful for me thinking about this question. So I do think we need a purpose, but I also want to emphasize that what you talked about, Anna, was the need of becoming as part of that, and I think it is kind of constant growth toward that fulfillment, and also that virtue is not static. Once you achieve it, if you achieve it, it's not guaranteed that you'll keep it. You got to also keep it sort of habituated, right? So you also can fall out of virtue. In some ways, you might actually become vicious versus virtuous, right? So I think it's important to recognize that. On Alistair McIntyre, a very influential book, McIntyre was a philosopher who wrote After Virtue. He worried that our world was so fragmented in our languages that we lived at a time after the language of virtue could be used successfully. So he tries to reclaim it and for our current world. And I think he's very helpful in centering virtue in the process, and the importance of practices that might help us cultivate virtues and find goods within those practices to help motivate us to do that. But also worry that McIntyre, in his own approach to this, actually is too nostalgic about this bygone past that was so coherent when it wasn't always coherent, and when the coherence was around things we might reject today, like racism or gender inequality, right? So one thing to be alert to is how we tell our what examples we choose to elevate in our stories affects the outcomes of our stories. We leave out certain examples of, he might think that we've not made any progress. We've made progress on race and gender since the 1950s and also since Aristotle's time. Thank goodness, right? So how we tell our stories is very important. So we're all parts of narratives all the time towards certain purposes, and being aware of our own narrative is vital for that, but also be aware of how our narrative might actually be telling stories we don't even realize. So we can be alert to our own biases and ways our stories might be constrained or affected by things we don't even see. So having people in your life who might challenge you, push you, hold you accountable can be very helpful for that process of becoming. So we just want to make a plug for friendships here as being very important to this process.
Other student questions? Ready? Practice your intellectual courage here.
Please,
if you want
yeah.
to. Yes, Bubba.
Yes.
Okay, so you guys talked a lot about pluralism, I think the word was, and how like our exemplars growing up helped to form who we are, and then also everybody has a kind of unique formation to their sense of self, and that's what leads to a lot of disagreement. I will say I'm curious about healthy and practical ways that won't lead to a feeling of helplessness to try and I'm even like against saying it now, but like reason with those that I disagree with, like on like the workings of the world, and especially like our current political state. I'd say that a lot of people in my generation are just so daily being filled with kind of a nihilistic like hopelessness, if not a sense of fear and hatred for others. Honestly, it's like as the days go on, it's like, well, this person disagrees with me in a certain way, but I thought they were on my side of the spectrum. And does that make them any better than somebody who completely wouldn't have either of us exist in their utopia? And even giving the person that thinks like that, I know it's like how they lived and the things that they've experienced created that kind of mindset for them. And it's like, how can I healthily acknowledge that and try to reason and not necessarily persuade, but like make the truths known of, you know what I mean? How like I can't like coexisting better. That's
Well, I
the
think
word
what you're
I can't-
saying is right. I think what you just said now is you have to practice empathy of a certain kind to imagine where someone else might be, to be able to then sort of to be in conversation with them, not as merely opponents, but as conversation partners, even if you disagree on certain things. I think it's really important. So I'll say a few things on this, and it's a really crucial question, and where the intellectual virtues can help in this context, right? Research shows in social science that the best way to persuade someone who differs from you is not to say, based on your own values, why they're wrong, but try to engage them on their own terms, on their own authorities, and try to understand what they're drawn to and argue from that about how they might get to a different conclusion. So it's called immanent critique in philosophy. It's called sometimes deep canvassing in political science, where you go around not just to say why your candidate's better on the door, but actually, what do you care about? What do you believe in? What are your authorities, right? What are your values? And then engaging them on those terms to say why your candidate, your policy is more effective, right? There have been studies showing, there's a great little article on this in the New York Times called The Key to Political Persuasion about this very question, where they have psychologists doing these studies about liberals, conservatives talking about these different issues, whether or not it's on their values or the other person's values and which one's more effective. It's always the latter, right? The other's value is more effective. So that's really crucial. We also seen some research by Rachel Wall at University of Virginia that these conversations often don't change people's minds about the actual policy position, but they change their relationships in important ways. And so they don't have the same kind of fear of the other, or they actually can be friends across different. So you might always persuade on the issue, but you might actually build more community by doing this work across these things. So I do think these intellectual virtues, like intellectual curiosity, is really important for empathy. It's kind of a gateway to empathy in many ways. Also humility, recognize that you may not be right all the time. There's a podcast now about the two former governors of Tennessee, my home state. One Democrat, one Republican. And it's like, I might not be right, is the idea. They talk about ideas in a very respectful way, but actually they disagree. But they actually are engaging across these boundaries to kind of acknowledge their own humility at their own limitations. But also, I think courage matters here, because it's easy to say, well, just whatever the person thinks, right? Let it go, let it be. We talk a lot about principle pluralism, right? Where actually you have to have principle yourself. You shouldn't forgo your own principles, especially in those cases where people might be denying others' humanity, right, and not doing justice. So what does courage require in those cases where you need to actually stand up for someone or something that might be causing others harm in some way? So I think you need those suite of virtues to do that well. But what would you add to that, Jason?
I mean, that's great. I think you have a great question, and there's no answer that won't be really complex and hard to implement. Um, I think part of the chasm is due to how insulated we are, right? So one sort of guiding principle question might be, how do I step outside of my own epistemic bubble, right? I think about the theme of friendship and relationships, right? Do I actually know people? Am I friends with people that see things very differently than I do? Another sort of principle that comes to mind for the Ted Lasso fans in the room is be curious, not judgmental. That's hard to do, and sometimes we need to be judgmental. But even if your interlocutor is, I'm taking a page from something, Dan, that you probably won't even remember that you said to me years ago. You may not like really be if your interlocutor has a view about something that is sufficiently reprehensible by your lights, then open-mindedness may not really be you may not see fit to sort of give a genuine open-minded hearing to this, but you can still ask, like, how did you come to see the world in that way? That's a way of exercising curiosity, that I think can help with the problem of mutual insularity and I mean that's where the hard work begins, right? But I think that is not a terrible principle to be thinking about, how we can practice curiosity in these contexts more quickly than we do judgment. We should get on to some other questions. Any other student questions? Okay, Marcella, you had your hands up.
Thank you.
A
Thank you.
particularly good student.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And when you were describing your graduate advisor, I thought, wow, that sounds like an amazing person. And immediately I thought, oh, academia doesn't really reward, for instance, that kind of curiosity, right? Where you're sort of exploring different methods and fields. And you mentioned it at the end. And I was wondering if thinking more, not so much now about how we teach or how we help students develop intellectual virtue, but how we as faculty, as people who work as academics, might develop our own in this structure, right? In this culture, in this constraints. And I wonder if you have done work about that, and also how you guys at Wake Forest have addressed it. So and we have some administrators here in the room. So you want to, as a university, you want to promote research. You want to have people who are specialized. You want to have people who have some degree of, you have some degree of objective criteria for excellence. How do you at the same time allow for instance, curiosity? Or, I mean, do you guys have any?
It's a great question. Yeah. And I love the question because I think it's so important for us. There's so many things in the academic life that crowd out these virtues. You're so overwhelmed with demands, with, responses, emails, right? And it can really crowd out these virtues. So I think intentional spaces like the work of the grant, I actually think it's really helpful. So I think book clubs, to actually be
part of one. Right?
Okay, good. Okay, great. Be curious learners again. I miss learning a lot. I got in this work, I like to learn. I don't learn much. I'm doing a lot of teaching now, but not learning as much. How do I learn to help me be a better teacher and scholar and person? And it's really important. Also, we have to eat lunches and dinners, right? If we can use our time, we catch up with our colleagues, it's time to talk about these questions. Today I had great talked to Dan and Jason independently about my own character journey, right? And that was really meaningful. In fact, I think that's a really important thing we can do as colleagues, right? In that context. So it doesn't have to be formal, it can be informal. But I do think creating spaces on campus. So we've offered, there's an institute at Wake Forest that offers funding for $500 a year to do a book club or an area of topic where students, faculty get incentivized to go and talk about a question they care about together and read books, and they buy the books with that money, and it becomes a way to kind of foster conversation and discussion in a formal way. So those are really helpful, but it's really hard because, you know, some of the best work I do as a teacher, I cannot put on my CV, right? Office hours conversations with students. In fact, it's often quite confidential. They're often quite personal or difficult conversations. So I think often the incentive structures are quite misaligned with the purpose of education. So how do we also make sure in tenure promotion processes and reappointment reviews, in departmental meetings, we make space for that? So one thing we do in our program is every team meeting we have every 2 weeks as a staff, we spend the first 15 minutes of that hour having somebody on our staff lead a discussion about something that matters to them. It could be a poem, it could be a video, it could be a song, it could be something from Chinese philosophy that speaks to their own character growth. And a way to open up spaces for us to have that be part of our conversation as a team, right? We need to do the work ourselves, even in our team meetings, right? Because that's got to be the grounding of our own projects. So how do you even start department meetings or others with these kind of questions, right? That could be an interesting sort of process to really make that more central to the work we do.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you very much. First of all, I enjoyed the conversation. I thought there was one Socrates and I don't know.
I hope
But
I'd
in
be
fact-
dangerous.
In fact, there were two
Give him
Socrates.
a hard time.
A gadfly.
Thank you very much. So many questions, and some of them you have already answered. I just want to bring attention to one particular issue, and that is the issue of how you might be able to articulate virtual language or a rehabilitation of virtue, both at the level of intellectual as well as moral virtues at the institutional level. On the one hand, institutions are becoming increasingly bureaucratic, as we know, and that means increasingly impersonal.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the rehabilitation of virtue at all levels entails a sort of retrieval of a notion of relationality,
Yeah.
a notion of proximity. That is the condition, for example, for being able to share not just norms or policies, but in fact, conversation about ultimate goods, about goals, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that is becoming increasingly different the more a university, I'm talking about universities now, of course,
Yeah.
issue might obtain for many other institutions. But for university, increasingly, we are turning into a reality that is, I don't want to say completely depersonalized, but one in which essentially the question is a question of transaction.
Yeah.
Right? So education is transaction. The relation among colleagues is transaction, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, one final observation. You get on an elevator at this university and everyone is on the cell phone. Sorry, this is a plea for keeping the cell phone down. But the point is, we have lost the ability to communicate at the most natural level, right? And so the introduction of the language of virtues, I think, presupposes a different ethos. And I wonder whether you can say something about that. In part, you have already spoken to it, but.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to think out loud about that for a minute. I think you're right. It does presuppose kind of a relational anthropology of
Yeah.
human nature, who we are. And also it also presupposes a sense that we as individuals are pursuing goods beyond just material or professional success, right? Because virtue has to go beyond those goods in some way. And I think that's in our increasingly consumeristic education environment that is more transactional. Those goods aren't always prioritized because it's becomes so expensive to have an education. So how do we get our money's worth, return on investment to make it worth it? So I think there are two things you can do. One is you can argue within that system to try to convince people to be a little bit different. So there's a book called Return on Character by Fred Keel. He's more of a business analyst and analyzes different businesses that actually have high character versus low character cultures. And it's found that actually those with high character cultures actually do better financially than those that don't. So now that's an instrumental argument for character. But if you then get people habituated into character, then they might have other more intrinsic goods they want to pursue beyond just the instrumental goods of financial security or success. And so I do think that's one way. The other way is say that actually introducing this language of virtue was going to push against that bureaucratic rationality and create some counter resistance to it, to actually seed some alternative modes of being and education. And that can be a good thing for our current moment. So I will say that we found in my own work at Wake Forest that we have a pretty relational culture there. We've had a tradition where characters always mattered to Wake Forest. But what now people are doing, including our board of trustees, are embracing this language to make sure we maintain the soul of the university. They use the word soul because they see this as that kind of way to maintain what we always have been against this increasingly competitive, bureaucratic, instrumentalizing, consumerist model of education. So I do think that if it becomes important enough, you can create a space for that alternative way of being to actually exist there. But I'm curious to see what Professor Baehr thinks about that.
That is just how the combination, Marcelo, of your question and Roberta's your question. I mean, we sort of focused on like teachers and students in the classroom, right? But for the sake of helping students grow in some of these ways. But you're underscoring, well, but really we need to be invested in this work as well for ourselves as faculty. And now, Roberto, you're helping us see how the focus needs to go from bottom all the way to the top. And so certainly a buy-in from university leadership will be important. And I think your point about the impersonal nature of institutions is very well taken, and likewise for the contrast between the impersonality of an institution and the deep personality of character and intellectual character formation. And that really is one of the things that attracts me to some of these ideas. I think many of us got into education not only to do scholarship, but because we thought of education as something that can form who we are as persons. And this is a language to articulate that. And if so, we can get the institution to use the language, that's not sufficient, right? But it's maybe a way of softening some of the impersonal institutional sort of obstacles to this kind of formation. Brian.
Yeah, I've got two questions that might be related or might not. So maybe I'll make the first one as an observation and the second one as a question. One of the difficulties in teaching for virtues, whether they're moral virtues or intellectual virtues, I found is just, I'm not speaking of any generation here, but collectively an impoverishment of language that makes it difficult to sort of thin slice between different characteristics, right? We praise people with generalities, like anyone with a clever idea is a genius, right? Even and et cetera. So I wonder, the observation is just that one of the difficulties for naming these virtues is the kind of thin slice vocabulary problem. And as I was thinking about that in your presentation, I was wondering, and here, this is the actual question, because I have no idea, but I wonder if either of your research indicates this. Like, I wonder if it just seems to me intuitively that we're more likely to be open to virtue language critically to point out vices as opposed to positively to praise virtues. And I wonder if in your research you've seen that people will default to, even if they don't have the language of vice and virtue, talking about virtue language and criticism, but then they don't sufficiently see the ways in which virtues, are positive.
Yeah, that's a great question, great point. And I think there are two places I've seen it in research on this. One is thinking about history of social movements. So if you look at history of social movements, both Amartya Sen and Anthony Appiah talk about the ways that movements from abolition of slavery to foot binding in China often rely not on agreeing on what our vision is, but what is bad and we want to resist. And that's what actually generates enough consensus to actually change the issue. So I do think that it's that there's it's one reason why community organizers often ask communities when they first get there, what makes you angry? That's the first question, because anger often is a motivating emotion. And also you can identify things that make you angry without agreeing on what solutions ought to be per se yet, right? It's a way to kind of get the conversation going. So there is kind of like a motivational power in that and critical power in that. But also I think we have to take the next step and think about what is even implicit in our criticism that might be implying a positive value or virtue, right? And so in a book that we have called Cultivating Virtue in the University, we have a chapter from Paula Moya and Leslie Larkin about decolonial virtues, about how this dystopian fiction that's often sort of really challenging colonial utopias actually might seem totally critical and deconstructive, but even that has a positive vision for what it ought to be embedded in it. And therefore, if we think about kind of deconstructing the deconstruction to actually identify some positive values, we actually can see virtues there. But I think it takes going the next step. I think we're really comfortable right now as a culture, especially in the academy, of only critiquing and not constructing or identifying within the critiques implicit values. And I think we have to help ourselves and others do some of that work, I think, and see that as a proper aim of education. That's my own sense of it.
Yeah. Brian, it's interesting. Forgive me if I'm not understanding the first part of your question, but one of the things that attracts me to virtue language in this context is that when we move from generic terms like intellectual character, intellectual virtue, to the specific qualities or traits or attributes, there you get this really nice, like rich, fine-grained, varied vocabulary. And the way I often think about it is that, look, as I mentioned earlier, like learning makes demands on our agency, on our choices and our values. It's not something that happens to us. So we have to decide to consider it. So what are those challenges? Well, sometimes it requires considering an alternative perspective. Sometimes it requires stepping back and asking thoughtful questions. Sometimes it requires attending to and acknowledging an intellectual limitation. Sometimes it requires being on the lookout for and avoiding mistakes. Well, intellectual virtues are they're like custom made for dealing with those various kinds of challenges or demands on our character or agency that arise in the learning process. And so you get this rich plurality of words like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual humility, intellectual courage, carefulness, thoroughness, autonomy, perseverance, courage, tenacity, and so on. Part of what's attracted me is that it's thick, right? It's thick, it's concrete, it's something that a fifth grader can understand and a university professor can understand. But at the same time, if Aristotle's right that that for any given virtue, there are many ways to go wrong, and one way to get it right, kind of makes sense that that vice language is going to be even more extensive and rich and varied.
That's a good last point, but I just wanted to say that you and I are on the same page on your first point. Like, I think the work you do in virtue and virtue theory more generally does give us the language to sort of distinguish between close things like open-mindedness and intellectual flexibility. Have a lot of overlap maybe, but are not the same thing. I'm just wondering about the difficulty in teaching it, that generally as a culture, we don't have a lot of rich language for talking about the specificity of different kinds of vices or virtues. We kind of default to sort of generic language until
Until,
we do,
yes,
yeah.
good.
So I
I see.
completely agree.
Gotcha. Okay, right, good. So, yeah, exactly. So I think that's exactly
It's one
right.
of the- exactly one of the things that's good about the
Yeah,
research is it allows us to thin slice.
Yeah.
Right, so think about like we talk in educational institutions about the value of lifelong learning or critical thinking, right? How often do we unpack what we mean by that, let alone think seriously about how our practices and postures in the classroom are aligned or misaligned with those aims? Well, part of what I love about this framework is that it gives us rich, fine-grained, concrete, personal language to unpack what we mean by that so we can better aim at it and better align what we do with it.
I'm gonna let John have the last question.
I'm gonna have to zip out. I'm
Oh,
gonna take some
okay.
people with me, maybe. It starts in 10 minutes on the other side of campus, but
So I'm interested in the role of practices in the way this works. So, because I think of practices as being to ethics what institutions are to politics. Right? They're the structures you build that help things sort of work. Academic practices, intellectual practices are notoriously hard to change and hard to build from scratch. So I want to think about two that came up in the process of your conversation. One has to do with our practices for faculty evaluation, right? Which how we look at a CV, how we look at a job letter, how we look at a tenure file, how we look at an annual evaluation. Those pretty clearly, I've learned over the course of my career, don't track very well at all to the intellectual virtue kind of having. And yet it's very hard to know how you could start a conversation that was designed to really reform those in meaning. The other is the essay assignment, which is probably the, at least a foundational practice of our academic lives that has been slowly disintegrating for most of my career and then suddenly collapsed 3 years ago as a valid way, I think, for us to keep doing the work we're doing. So there's one where you'd have to build from scratch, and I don't know how. Any thoughts about that?
Easy questions for the last one. Okay, thanks, John.
there you go.
Yeah, you're smart here, intellectual, yeah, courage, Jason. Courage, yeah. It's a great question, John, and I think the question of evaluation and hiring is especially tricky. You don't want to also take a character test to get a job or to get tenure. That seem odd, but maybe we can think about how we can be more explicit about how our processes of promotion, tenure, evaluation actually reflect university priorities. So we care not just about our academic field specializations, but actually university priorities there. And can we name that if you don't care about teaching, you're not going to get tenure at Wake Forest, right? Well, are there ways to think about how you think about that process? Willingness to improve in your teaching, right? Openness to different perspectives on teaching. Are there ways to think about integrating those virtues into those categories that might make it a bit easier to navigate that complexity? On the essay, I think you're right. You got to be more imaginative, and I think that's why I think where the practices come into actually having students do the thing, not just write about it or talk about it. I think it's really helpful. But it means us having to also think about how we grade differently, because we can't just grade based on a rubric that we've had for 20 years on an essay. We've got to actually know how we grade differently and create other chances to actually evaluate students. It's not always based on written products, but on expression, even on growth in some way.
Let's thank these guys. Michael will still be hanging around. Jason sucks.